It all started with the $10 bill, housed in a glass case, sitting quietly for nearly 40 years on a shelf in the offices of the Ensign C. Markland Kelly Jr. Memorial Foundation in Baltimore, Maryland. Then one day, a director decided to examine the bill more closely, and what he discovered would ultimately rewrite one chapter of the most famous naval battle in U.S. history, the Battle of Midway. This is the story behind the Hornet Air Group and the flight to nowhere. The Battle of Midway is easily the most famous and important battle in the history of the United States Navy, and countless books, articles, and even 2 feature movies have been produced about it. Yet, as well studied as it is, there is one aspect that remains contentious and is still much discussed: the flight path flown by the Hornet Air Group on the morning of June 4, 1942. It is known in the history books as the flight to nowhere. In this presentation, I will delve into the strange saga of what and how it is that we came to know what happened. First, as a bit of background, Hornet was one of 3 U.S. carriers taking part in the battle, the others being Yorktown and Enterprise. Hornet and Enterprise operated together as Task Force 16. Like the other carriers, Hornet carried 4 squadrons of aircraft: Torpedo 8 with Devastator torpedo bombers, Scouting 8 with Dauntless dive bombers, Bombing 8 also with Dauntlesses, and Fighting 8 with Wildcat fighters. An overall commander of the air group was Stanhope Ring. The captain of Hornet was Mark Mitcher. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force, known as the Kido Butai, launched an attack on Midway Atoll preliminary to a planned invasion 2 days later. A PBY Catalina patrol aircraft from Midway spotted the strike force and reported its position. The Hornet, along with Enterprise, launched its air group of 4 squadrons with the intent of striking the carriers. What happened next is where the mystery lies. The air group essentially fell apart. The torpedo squadron, VT-8, led by John Waldron, located the Japanese fleet and attacked, but the squadron was annihilated by Japanese Zero fighters, with all planes being shot down and only one pilot managing to survive. However, none of the other squadrons even located the enemy. Yet, of the 59 planes that took off that morning, only 20 returned to Hornet. Besides the destruction of VT-8, 11 dive bombers landed at Midway, while 3 others and all the fighters ditched due to fuel exhaustion. How could this have happened? The only official report filed by any of the Hornet commanders was submitted by Captain Mark Mitcher. He wrote that after the Hornet Air Group departed Hornet, it flew a course of 239 degrees, often rounded to 240 in other reports, expecting to intercept the enemy fleet at a distance of 155 miles. When the enemy was not found at the expected point of interception, the Hornet Air Group, aside from the torpedo bombers, turned south in order to search along the line of advance of the enemy fleet. The torpedo bombers instead turned north, that is, to the right, where the enemy was actually located. At this point, the rest of the squadrons became separated, with each one choosing to either head towards Midway or return to the Hornet. According to Mitcher, the fighters also turned towards Midway due to low fuel, but none of them made it. Mitcher assumed that the fighters went down somewhere along the line of approach to Midway, bearing 320, but was without actual information as to the location. It would later turn out that 8 of the 10 fighter pilots would be rescued by PBY Catalina flying boats, but the remaining 2 were never found. Mitcher's assumed location of where the fighters went down was never updated, and would eventually become part of the official record. One of the pilots not rescued was named Mark Kelly. Mark's father, Markland Kelly Sr., was devastated when he learned of the loss of his son, particularly because he wasn't provided any information on the circumstances surrounding his death. At the time, Kelly Sr. was a prosperous car salesman in Baltimore. To perpetuate his son's name, he established the Ensign C. Markland Kelly Jr. Memorial Foundation. At some point after the war, Kelly Sr. was given a $10 bill called a short snorter, the significance of which will be explained in a moment, by one of the Catalina air crew who had helped rescue 4 of the other pilots in Kelly's squadron, and it was added to the collection of memorabilia maintained by the foundation. Bowen Weisheit had been a friend and fraternity brother of Mark before the war. During the war, he had served as a navigator in the Marine Corps. Afterward, he became a real estate lawyer. Many years later, he was appointed as a director of the Markland Kelly Foundation. One day, while in the foundation's office, he noticed the $10 bill kept in a glass case. Pulling it out, he immediately recognized it as being a short snorter. Now, I won't explain where the name came from, But the tradition at the time was that if a pilot who had ditched in the ocean were rescued by a PBY Catalina, that pilot would pull out the largest bill in his pocket, give it to the PBY crew, and they would fill out the names of all involved, the date and time of the rescue, and the coordinates of where the rescue took place. In this case, 3 pilots had been rescued at the same time: Pat Mitchell, Richard Gray, and Stan Rouleau, 5 days after the battle. Being a former navigator, Weisheit decided to check out where the coordinates fell on a navigation chart. He was stunned to find that they were over 150 nautical miles away from the assumed position that Mark Mitcher had marked on the Hornet Air Group's track chart nearly 40 years earlier. Clearly something was amiss. Weisheit decided to undertake a quest to find out what had happened. The quest would last 4 years. In a nutshell, with help from the Navy archives, author John Lundstrom, and various chance encounters, he was able to track down 5 of the fighter pilots who had flown with Kelly that day, along with pilots and crewmen from other squadrons, plus the Hornet's air operations officer. He even located the PBY crewman who had given the short snorter bill to Kelly Sr. Weisheit interviewed all these people either in person or by phone, and made recordings and transcripts of those interviews. Consequently, most of the record is preserved today. Now, these interviews were all 40 years after the event, and memories had inevitably become faded and confused. Pretty much everyone had read books about the battle, so their stories started incorporating events that they could not have known at the time. Nevertheless, from these interviews, Weisheit learned 2 important facts about the flight of the Hornet Air Group that day. First, Waldron and Torpedo 8 had split off from the group after about a half hour and in direct violation of orders. Second, the fighter pilots became concerned about low fuel levels, Wildcats having shorter endurance than the bombers, and they too left the Hornet Air Group without permission in order to return to the Hornet. For whatever reason, they were not able to pick up the Hornet's navigation beacon, and they eventually all ditched from fuel exhaustion, having flown past the Hornet's position. That would explain why the pilots were rescued so far from Mitcher's assumed position. Mitcher simply didn't know the story of the fighter pilot's mutinous behavior at the time that he wrote his report. However, Weisheit made another unexpected discovery. Remember that on Mitcher's chart, Waldron had broken off to the right and had located the Japanese fleet to the north of the Hornet Air Group's course. 2 of the pilots that Weisheit had interviewed said they saw Waldron break off, but that he went to the left, which would have been possible only if the Hornet Air Group had taken a much more northerly course. Weisheit's suspicions were confirmed when he interviewed Walter Rodee, commander of Scouting Squadron 8. When asked if he had taken course 240, Rodee replied, "No, it was about 265. 260, 265. It was almost due west." That course would indeed have sent the Hornet Air Group north of the Japanese fleet, about 100 miles northwest of where they would have expected to encounter it if flying 240. With this information, Weisheit was now able to construct a new track chart that incorporated all that he had learned, which will be shown on the next slide. As an aside, a 3rd airman, Richard Woodson, was interviewed by Ron Russell, who also stated that he saw Waldron break off to the left. Now, for many years, Ron hosted the Battle of Midway Roundtable for veterans of the battle, and Ron wrote the book No Right to Win based on accounts of the battle made by those veterans. Ron has written extensively about the flight to nowhere, and he placed the audio files and transcripts obtained by Weisheit on the website midway42.org, from where they can be downloaded today. This is the chart that Weisheit created. On this chart, the Hornet Air Group flew north, not south of the Japanese fleet, and Waldron's track, shown in red, departs that of the rest of the group to the left. On the return, each squadron took a different route, but other than Waldron, all managed to miss locating the enemy. Good luck was not with the Hornet Air Group that morning. That was the end of Weisheit's analysis. Weisheit published his findings in the book The Last Flight of Ensign C. Markland Kelly, Jr., USNR, which can be found online at the Markland Kelly Foundation website. Since then, multiple historians and authors, including John Lundstrom, John Parshall, Craig Simons, Robert Mrazek, Mark Stilley, and Ron Russell, have concurred with Weisheit's conclusion, and furthermore decided that the odd course was chosen deliberately by Mitcher, but then he lied about it in his after-action report to cover up the fact that it would have been seen as a violation of his orders. Indeed, this version of events is taken to be all but established fact. How Mitcher came to select course 265 has been an area of considerable speculation. The operation plan from Nimitz indicated in 2 places that the Japanese might divide their forces into 2 or more groups. The final intelligence report 4 days later stated that the Japanese strike force contained 4 carriers. However, the first and only position report received on June 4th mentioned only 2 carriers, so it is possible that Mitscher thought that the other 2 were positioned somewhere behind, although why he would have guessed 100 miles behind is not explained. The U.S. normally operated each carrier in its own task force, but for combined operations, the task forces were always in close proximity to one another. Additionally, as has been suggested that Mitscher, a career aviator, may have felt that he knew better how to fight the battle than the task force commanders Fletcher and Spruance, who were both non-aviators. However, Mitscher's direct orders actually came from the officer in tactical command, George Murray, who was captain of the Enterprise and also a lifelong aviator with bragging rights over Mitscher. And it was Murray who ordered Mitscher to attack one of the carriers that had been spotted. And that is where I will stop for now. It is certainly a remarkable story, starting with a $10 bill sitting in a glass case for nearly 40 years and ending up rewriting a chapter in the history books, but one that is still mired in controversy. In part 2, I will start with Weisheit's finding of Course 265 and see how it compares with other evidence we have regarding the battle.